in today's discussion, I'm going to try and show in a humble way that Islam and sometimes religion in general has made the world a better place. Now that doesn't mean it hasn't made it a bad place, because it has, okay? I agree with this assertion that religion can be used as a negative social, political, economic tool, especially if we look into the history of Europe. Because what happened, the Catholic tradition specifically used the coercive arm of the state to prevent any thinking that was incongruous with its dogma. And Europe has suffered a lot. We had the massacre on St. Bartholomew's Day, we had the 80-year wars, the 30-year wars, and in a way Europe has suffered tremendously in the name of religion. However, this European specific historical baggage shouldn't be superimposed on the Islamic historical narrative. Although Islamic history hasn't always been rosy, but it's been rosier than European history. Because we didn't have generally a clash between the thinkers and the scientists and those in power. It's happening today because of despots and dictators, not because of the Islamic political ethical paradigm. Something we're going to discuss later. So the reasons for my assertion that religion, or specifically Islam, has made the world a better place is going to be based around sociological, historical and philosophical premises. Now before I get into that, I want to basically have a note. And this note is very important, and I'm going to be discussing politics and war. Because you have the outdated cliche, which I don't want outdated cliches today. If I have any outdated cliches, please tell me off. I really want to have a conversation. I don't want to have a debate anymore. I think debates are useless, yeah, frankly. I just want to have a conversation, okay? Just like in my Greek village, we go up 800 meters high, we sit in the coffee shop over Greek tea, rather coffee, and we just discuss politics, man, life, and the universe. That's what Greeks usually do. So we do in our village, okay? All the way up in northwest Greece. So I want to have a conversation with you guys. Now, the claim is that religion has caused wars. You hear this all the time. It's evil, it's oppressive, it's created all these disasters. But I think we must be a little bit more nuanced. Just like in the words of Professor William T. Kavanagh in his excellent book, which I suggest everyone reads. It's called The Myth of Religious Violence. Now he's not saying there has been no religious violence, it's just a sexy title if you like, yeah? And he said, this is published by Oxford, and he says, what I call the myth of religious violence is the idea that religion is a trans-historical and trans-cultural feature of human life, essentially distinct from secular features such as politics and economics, which has a peculiarly dangerous inclination to promote violence. And he says, I challenge this piece of conventional wisdom, not simply by arguing that ideologies and institutions labeled secular can be just as violent as those labeled religion, but by examining how the twin categories of religious and secular are constructed in the first place. And his thesis in this book actually advocated an interesting understanding on how we could reconcile what's happened in history in Europe and what's happening in the secular West, which unfortunately has also been very violent and aggressive. Interestingly, one of the four horsemen, the new atheist horseman if you like, Sam Harris, in his book The End of Faith, he dramatically illustrates the idea that atheist and secular worldviews can be violent. And he says in his book that you should condemn the irrational torture of witches, which is true, and we agree with this. But then he goes on to say, and he provides his own argument for torturing terrorists. And interestingly, he charges himself, I think, with the conviction that the secular West cannot reason with Muslims, but must deal with them by force, in his own book. Now, I'm not saying this is representative of secular atheist discourse, it's not. I wouldn't say such a thing, and Mike would agree with me, it's not representative of atheist secular discourse, but it shows that both worldviews, any ideology, can be violent and aggressive. Interestingly, Professor Stephen L. Carter, in his publication Civility on page 252, he sums this up very nicely, and he says, the statement that wars have been fought in the name of God is non sequitur. As the theologian Walker Wint once pointed out, more people have died in the 20th century secular wars than in the preceding 50 centuries of fighting combined. So if you want a numbers game, more people have died in the name of secularism or ideology than people have died in the name of religion. And we have many examples like Chairman Mao, Stalin, Pol Pot, the recent war in Iraq, etc., etc. Let me go now to my first premise, the sociological premise. According to modern academic studies in the sociology of religion, there have been longitudinal and meta-analytical studies that have shown that religion is good for you. Okay? Now this doesn't mean there's other religion is not good for you, but what if I've been critical in my research, which means I've taken studies that are of the mainstream with regards to the academia in the sociology of religion, and it's not just one study, it's based on 2,000 studies, 300 studies, longitudinal studies, etc., to show that academics are saying, forget if the belief is right or wrong, from a sociological perspective, religion is good for the world. For example, in 2002, Smith, McCullough and Paul, in their journal, A Meta-Analytic Review of the Religiousness Depression Association, Evidence for Main Effects and Stress Buffering Effects, carried out an analysis of over 200 social studies and found that high religiousness predicts rather lower risk of depression, drug abuse, and fewer suicide attempts. In 2002, Brian Johnson and the colleagues of the University of Pennsylvania Center of Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society reviewed around 500 studies that had been published in peer-reviewed journals. They concluded that a large majority of the studies showed a positive correlation between religious commitment and higher levels of perceived well-being, self-esteem, lower levels of hypertension, believe it or not, depression, and criminal delinquency. In the Handbook of Religion and Health, edited by Harold Koenig, Michael McCullough, and David Larson, the authors reviewed 2,000 published experiments designed to test the relationship between religion and various medical conditions such as heart disease, cancer, and depression. The overall results were that religious people tend to live longer and have physically healthier lives. Young people have significantly lower levels of drug and alcohol abuse, criminal delinquency, and attempted suicide. Even in China, an officially irreligious state, a recent study by Paul Badham and Xingzong Yao for the Ian Ramsey Center at Oxford University reported that a majority of the people who had religious experiences, even if they were atheists, had a positive effects on their lives. Interestingly, in 2000, political scientist and Professor Robert Putnam surveyed 200 volunteer organizations, and it showed that there was a positive correlation between religiosity and membership of volunteer organizations. And to sum this up, in the Index of Global Philanthropy in 2007, it states, religious people are far more charitable than non-religious, not only given to their own congregations, but also regardless of income, region, social class, and other demographic variables. Significantly more charitable in their secular donations and informal giving. So we see from the sociology of religion, not based upon religious people, it's not a mad mullah speaking or a Christian cleric or someone who is opposed to the secular worldview. This is balanced, modern, mainstream academic studies. Actually made the world a better place because it gave us, human beings, the concept of the presumption of innocence. Number two, it gave us the ideas of tolerance. Number three, it facilitated the Renaissance. Big claims, but this is Western historical academia. Let's talk about the concept of the presumption of innocence. This aspect is undoubtedly the most durable merit of Muslim influence as illustrated by the administration of justice. Until the Crusades, legal procedure in the West consisted of God's judgments by boiling water or by duel or by ordeal during the people which they were burned with red hot irons or boiling oil, and if they survived, they were declared not guilty. And he continues, in contrast, we have only to quote the instructions given by Omar, which is the right-hand man of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, in the 7th century to the Muslim judges, to show what a chasm separated the two conceptions. He says, only decide on the basis of proof. Be kind to the weak that they can express themselves freely without fear. Deal on an equal footing with litigants by trying to reconcile them. And Marcel Bassard, he continues, from Islam's beginnings, the suspect was presumed innocent until it could be proved otherwise. And he says, it is certainly not a coincidence that Louis IX was the monarch who created the French legal administration by appointing the royal inquirers, by instituting testimonial proof, and by permitting the recourse of making a plea to the king. The legislation he introduced marked a turning point in the history of law in Europe, in where we live. And he continues that Louis IX had frequently had the philosophic theologians of his time at his table. And he says St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, visited him. But then he continues, the influence of Islam was, however, even more direct. We can make the presumption, since it was on his return from Palestine that the king undertook his major legal reforms. Jean de Joinville, the chronicler of St. Louis, gives us fairly clear proof in his own chronicles. So Islam, based upon the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, gave us the presumption of innocence to the West, as indicated strongly by Western historical academics. The second point I'd like to make is the treatise on tolerance. Now, Islam continued to influence European thought profoundly into the 18th century. John Locke, the famous John Locke, was one of those influenced by Islam. He was known to have attended lectures on Islamic studies delivered by the first Orientalist known as Edward Pocock in the 17th century at Oxford University. Now, Pocock spent years collecting Islamic manuscripts in Syria, and upon his return to England, he was appointed lecturer of Islamic studies. Now, John Locke was deeply fascinated by Pocock's learning and academic ability as a result of his link to the Islamic tradition. And he elaborates on his fascination by expressing, in his own words, knew not anyone in the university whom he would more willingly consult. And he says about Pocock that he had often the silence of a learner and the knowledge of a master. Now, Locke's On Civil Government considers the notion of sovereignty as a trust. This is the Islamic method of governing, also known as the Khalifa. And the fact that Locke discusses it as a political philosophy reinforces the influence of Islamic theology. Now, John Locke treatises, which coincide with the Islamic emphasis on tolerance, are often referred to as the decisive influence on Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. So we have a direct link from the Islamic learning when the Islamic scholars talked about tolerance, because we know in Islamic Spain there was a convivencia between the Jews, between the Christians and the Muslims, and they were together, and there were libraries, and there was learning. It was a fascinating time. And it was from this environment that basically Pocock learned from. And Pocock influenced John Locke. So Islam, in a way, gave us tolerance, as well as the presumption of innocence. Now let me give you some examples that this is not just a historical accident, but it resonated throughout the Islamic Caliphate. For example, in the 15th century, in 1420, a rabbi, a Jew, Yizdak Saftari, he wrote a letter to his persecuted German brethren from the Ottoman Turkish territory, inviting them to join in the prosperous and tolerant Islamic lands. He says, "Your cries and laments have reached us. We have been told of all the sorrows and persecutions which you suffer in the lands. Listen, my brothers, if you knew even the 10th of what God has blessed us within this land, you would give heed to no further difficulties." Also, we have another rabbi, an Italian rabbi, Obeida Yara de Bertonoro. He traveled to Jerusalem in 1486, and he says, "The Jews are not persecuted by Arabs in these parts. I have traveled the country in its length and breadth, and none of them has put an obstacle in my way. They are very kind to strangers, particularly to anyone who does not know the language. And if they see many Jews together, they are not annoyed by it. In my opinion, an intelligent man versed in political science might easily raise himself to be the chief of the Jews as well as the Arabs." My final point from the historical perspective is that Islam facilitated the Renaissance, progress. Now, after Toledo was taken by the Christians in the 11th century, to be precise in 1085, a school was established which focused mainly on producing translations from Arabic to other European languages, because we know most of the Greek Hellenic writings of medicine and philosophy were actually translated via the Arabic works from the Muslim scholars. Now, many scholars from Europe traveled there to work on the translations. For instance, Gerard of Cremona translated 80 works from Arabic to Latin on astronomy, mathematics, which includes Khwarizmi's algebra, Thabit ibn Qurra's work on Roman balance, Al-Kindi's optical works, etc., etc. John of Seville, he translated astronomical, medical and philosophical works by Al-Kindi, Al-Batani, Thabit ibn Qurra, al-Qabbisi and al-Firani. He also translated Ibn Sina's al-Shifa, the healing, and al-Ghazali's Maqasid al-Falasifa, the ways of the philosophers. Plato of Trivoli made a substantial amount of translations from Arabic to Latin, for instance, listing every translator with the translations and a vivid picture of the tremendous influence of the Arabs' works in these very few. He also, for instance, many other scholars travelled from Europe to study in Islamic Spain, among whom were Gerbert of Aurillac, also known as Pope Sylvester II, Adelard of Bath, Daniel of Morlaix, who was one of the scholars responsible for the establishment of Oxford University. And this continues and continues. And we have an amazing history where Islamic Spain, which was governed by Sharia law, facilitated the tolerant principles so people could actually progress and discuss and have this freedom of thought. Because interestingly, if you look at the establishment of freedom of thinking, freedom of thought, you would see that it's traced back to the 8th century in Islam. The historians say that freedom of thought started to emerge under the Islamic Caliphate. It is no wonder Professor Thomas Arnold, he declares the Renaissance, which is the scientific revolution from the 15th to the 16th century, as originating from Islamic Spain. And this is quite fascinating. And he says, in his own words, Muslim Spain had written one of the brightest pages in history of medieval Europe. Her influence has passed through province into other countries of Europe, bringing to birth a new poetry and new culture, and it was from her that Christian scholars received what of Greek philosophy and science they had to stimulate their mental activity up to the time of the Renaissance. According to historians, the Renaissance is an Islamic origin, it's an Islamic phenomenon. It is no wonder Adam Smith, the 18th century founder of modern capitalism, he states, please, gentlemen, just for the sake of cultural discourse, I do ask you to have some manners, please. You could talk after. Thank you. He states, Adam Smith states, the ruin of the empires of the Romans, and along with it the subversion of law and order, which happened a few centuries afterwards, produced the entire neglect of that study of the connecting principles of nature to which leisure and security can alone give occasion. He continues, after the fall of the great conquerors and the civilizers of mankind, the empire of the caliphs seems to have been the first state under which the world enjoyed that degree of tranquility which the cultivation of the sciences requires. It was under the protection of those generous and magnificent princesses that the ancient philosophy and astronomy of the Greeks were restored and established in the East. And he says, that tranquility which the mild, just and religious government diffused over the vast empire revived the curiosity of mankind to inquire into the connecting principles of nature. Adam Smith, the founder of modern capitalism. Now, we've shown that Islam has given a lot to the world. So, Islam was very important for the world. We are better off because of Islam and because of religion as seen by the sociological studies. And everything that Michael's probably going to say, I'm going to agree with him because religion can be used for bad and can be used for evil. But the discussion is, are we better off with religion also? And we are. Not only from a sociological perspective as seen by Western academics, but also from a historical perspective on the presumption of innocence, on the Renaissance, and on the treatise on tolerance, which formed secular society and is linked directly to the Islamic works. This is why I mentioned in the beginning, let's not take a specific European history and superimpose it on the Islamic narrative. It's a logical fallacy to do that. Christianity was bad in Europe, therefore all religion is bad. It doesn't follow. So let me just end anyway with a philosophical argument. And basically, we're using the word here, better. I want you to think about this very carefully. The word better is used. We're making a value judgment. We're making almost a moral claim. But with respect, and this is a humble suggestion, can we make such an objective claim in absence of religion, specifically in absence of the divine? Because if you think about it, in absence of the divine, there is no foundation for objective moral truths. Our discussion is just subjective and relative. It is just subjective and relative. Now, what do I mean by objective here? Look, what I mean by objective is in the words of the Professor of Theology and Ethics, Ian Markham. He says, embedded in the word ought is the sense of a moral fact transcending our life and world. The underlying character of moral language implies something universal and external. So it transcends human subjectivity, human consensus. For example, if all of you agreed that it's okay to kill me for no reason, it will still be a morally bad thing to do. It transcends our human consensus and subjectivity. So when we use words like better, this is wrong, religion is bad, you guys are evil, your Quran says all these things, that you could beat your wives and you could chop the hands of the thief, apparently. But even making those moral judgments, can we make those moral judgments in an objective way? No, we can't. It's a philosophical absurdity to even assert them in an objective manner. Let's be honest. For instance, the late J.L. Mackie, the famous atheist, in his book Ethics, he said there are no objective moral truths. Also, Bertrand Russell, he observed, ethics arises from the pressures of the community on the individual. Man does not always instinctively feel the desires which are useful to his herd. The herd, being anxious and the individual should act in his interest, has invented various devices for causing the individual's interest to be in harmony with that of the herd. One of these is morality. Also, Michael Nugent, another atheist, a philosopher of science, he explains morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction. Any deeper meaning is illusory. So when we point the finger and say this is really bad objectively, then what basis do we have if we don't have the divine in the first place? Because the reason I'm saying we can't have objective moral values or objective value judgments in absence of the divine, because the divine is the only conceptual anchor that transcends human subjectivity, and that is objective. This is why philosopher Ian Markham, he explains, God explains the mysterious ought, that kind of feeling that we have that we ought to do something, pressing down on our lives. And God explains the universal nature of the moral claim. As God is outside of the world, God the Creator can be both external and make universal commands. Now, this is besides the fact if you believe He exists or not. That's irrelevant. We're talking about this philosophically and conceptually. Now, someone may claim, what about biology? Biology can give us a foundation for objective moral truths, objective value judgments. And unfortunately, it can't. Because biological evolution states that we are products of a lengthy biological process, and our morals or our sense of judgments have evolved like our unwanted hair or our teeth. This is why Darwin, interestingly, in 1882, he wrote, if men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill the fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering if we're just a product of a biological process. This is why Daniel Dennett, I think he's the other one of the four horsemen of the neo-atheist narrative, he says about rights that there are nonsense on stilts, meaning they don't have any greater meaning. And some may argue, well, natural selection actually gives us objective moral foundation for morality, where it doesn't. If you take the moral philosopher Philip Kitcher, he writes, all that natural selection can do, may have done for us, is to equip us with the capacity for various social arrangements and the capacity to formulate ethical rules. It doesn't give us the ontological objective foundation for moral truths. So biology is not an option. What about social consensus? Well, if we say if humans come together progressively to say what's good or bad, or to give us a sense of that objective morality, well, there's huge implications here. It would mean that if we're in Tibet in the 1930s, we'll be putting our newborn babies in freezing cold water. If it means we're born in 1940s Germany, it means we'll be killing Jews. We'll be going to church on Sunday and hunting them in the forest right after Mass. If it's just social consensus. That's not an objective foundation for moral claims. So, is there an alternative? There is another alternative, and that's called moral realism, which means, and many atheist philosophers adopt this, to say moral value is objective and they just are. But this is very interesting. How is that philosophical? How is that rational? They just are. Because we can claim God just is, the Prophet Muhammad upon whom be peace just is, the Quran just is without any justification. So moral realism doesn't hold rational ground. So to conclude, in the works of the ethicist Richard Taylor, he basically says, the modern age, more or less repudiating the idea of a divine lawgiver, has nevertheless tried to retain the ideas of moral right and wrong, not noticing that in casting God aside, they have also abolished the conditions of the meaningfulness of moral right and wrong as well. So how does this link to our discussion? Well, it links to our discussion because we're making value judgments today. This is better, this is bad, this is evil, this is good. Are we making them in an objective way? If that's the case, it necessitates God's existence, because He is the only conceptual anchor that transcends human subjectivity, the only basis for objective morality. If we're not saying in an objective way, then this discussion is subjective and relative. Then I have my right to be evil, your perceived evil, and I have my right to be good, which is my own perceived good, if it's just relative or if it's just subjective. So in a way, in my humble opinion, an atheist adopting the atheistic worldview, even discussing this topic, is actually equivalent of shooting himself in the foot. Because to be objective about it, it necessitates the existence of God. Now you may argue, God doesn't exist, there are no objective moral values. Then fine, let me be, let you be. Because it's just relative and subjective from that perspective. Thank you very much for listening.